We are committed to creating a safe and supportive space for our guests and listeners, and to provide information and tools that will help our listeners understand, manage, and overcome trauma. We understand that the healing journey can bring up challenging emotions. Therefore, we want to warn our audience that certain episodes may contain discussions or stories that could be triggering for some individuals. The content of the podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and we encourage you to practice self-care and discretion while listening, and to reach out to a trusted support system or professional if you feel overwhelmed and need help on your healing journey.
So I have to tell you, our conversation that we had was so good, and I have been so excited about doing this podcast. And it really, one of the things that it expanded my mind on, it was kind of the final push, was really trying to find these areas that are really we don't think about,
Yeah.
you know.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think, and it's great to be on a podcast, right? Because it helps me reach people maybe that I don't get access to through my professional work about this type of topic, right? And
Hmm.
safety sports and something, yeah, that we don't often dig into just to recognize the problem that it really presents, right? And I tell people all the time that I think recognizing the problem that it presents puts us on the path to improve sports, right? I love sports. I tell people all the time,
Hmm.
I love it. I've seen behind the curtain and seen the damage that sports can do, and it's immense. But it's a part of who I am, right? My kids play sports. I played sports, for a long time, and we have to do better of recognizing the potential for risk and abuse that sports creates. When we get there, when we're able to marry the idea that sports can do great things but also can do bad things, bring those two topics together and understand that we can create a safer environment for everybody. And so anytime I can get in front of an audience to just help them understand, right? Understand the prevalence of abuse in sports, but
Hmm.
also understand the benefit of sports and
Sure.
some of the things that they can do or they can be on the lookout for to just increase their understanding and knowledge bases. I'm all for it because it's just such an important topic to me.
Yeah, yeah. And Bobby, I'll say, I was so impressed, and I've been nonstop talking about our conversation, literally. And as soon as we got done, I walked out to my husband because he's very much into sports. He had 3 scholarships going to college: golf, football, and basketball, and he took golf. But he said, "Boy, I must have been really lucky." I said, "Okay, I get that, but let's talk about that." Did you have coaches that screamed at you? You know?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting part, right? Is some of us, a lot of us are lucky, right? And there's so much research about the positive benefits of sports out there. I tell people that, about 50%, a little over 50% on a conservative estimate of youth play sports every year, right? So 50% of the youth in this country have played sports in the last 12 months. Conservative estimates put that number somewhere in about 25 million youth are playing sports every year, right? It's a massive number. And when you look at the positive benefits, it's great, right? Like, there were
Mhm.
some studies done of parents, and those parents said, I think it was somewhere around 73% said that they thought their child had mental health benefits from participating in sport. More
Mhm.
than 80% of adults said my child had physical benefits from participating in sport. And we all acknowledge that, right? Sports provide a sense of community, as belonging. Obviously the exercise and just the physical activity that it brings along, all very beneficial. And the numbers are huge, right?
Mhm.
25 million kids. And I was a philosophy major from the University of Alabama, so math is not my forte. I can just tell you those are big numbers. So
Right.
that's great. So we talk about the positive benefits, but exactly what you're talking about. Not only do we not understand how much abuse is out there, there's not a clear understanding, even at the athlete or coach level, what is abuse.
Mhm.
What is sexual abuse tends to be more black and white, especially when it's adult to minor, right? We can say that is wrong. That is something that, just from any perspective, it's clear to recognize and we understand it's a problem. As a society, we have a lot more difficult time recognizing what is physical abuse and what is mental or emotional abuse, right? Physical abuse, I had a great experience during sports, but I can look back now and say some of the things that I experienced may have, pushed boundaries, right? Just like
Mhm.
your husband, you says, I must have been lucky because I had a great experience. Some of us fail to recognize some of the practices that maybe we saw or that the coaches employed, push boundaries. But then there are, to me, also, emotional and physical abusive practices still used today that do cross the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Have to do a better job of understanding what those practices are so that we can recognize them. And also so those youth athletes who would not necessarily recognize them because that's the way they've always been coached, they've always been taught to say, hey, this isn't okay, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
for all of those positive impacts I mentioned, right? Like the huge percentage of kids whose parents feel like they got a positive impact, whether it's emotionally, mentally, physically, there are some really, really big issues that happen when kids or youth or even young adults are subjected to physical, emotional, or sexual abuse within sports, right? We see, there are health issues, right? Where, maybe they're just maybe, but there are also those ACEs, right? Those adverse childhood experiences. It has long lasting impacts on people's health that we know
Mm-hmm.
now. But there are also, you see studies that show that kids who are subjected to abuse through sport suffer academically, right? Things that we don't necessarily realize. I've seen issues with self-esteem, PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, body image issues. I mean, the potential for negative impacts are massive as well. It does not mean that we can't hold sport in high regard for all the benefits it offers. It just means we have to take a step back and realize
Mm-hmm.
that there can be some negative consequences if sports is used to negatively impact someone, especially through abusive practices. And we can do more, right? We know how many people play in sports. So, my goal is to do everything I can to make it more likely that someone had an experience like I did, right? That I can look back at when I was a, 18-year-old playing soccer. I look back at it, can smile and say, this was a fantastic experience. How do we make that more common than, people looking back and saying, like, no, I did not enjoy. I stopped playing sports because of the things that I was put through, or it still has a lasting impact in a negative way onto me today. And I tell people all the time, there is hope we can get there. I am an optimist, and I know without a doubt that we can continue to improve our sports culture across this country. We just have to kind of buy into it, right? And understand the amount of abuse out there, the way to recognize it, the way to prevent
Mm-hmm.
it. And those are really key steps. And I keep mentioning the prevalence of abuse. And it's not just a US problem, it's not a Canadian problem, it's not a UK, it's not a European problem, it's a global problem. And
Mm-hmm.
those because there are studies from each one of those countries out there that show just the prevalence of abuse, right? I just told you 25 million kids play sports in the US alone. Just think about how many play on a global scale.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reviewing just some research papers that had came out, and that are widely regarded and accepted through the sporting community. And there was one that focused on youth athletes who were considered elite, right? Who were competing at a high level. 31% of the female athletes who were considered elite said that they were subjected to sexual abuse within sport before they were 18. 31%, massive number. 21% of young men indicated they were affected by sexual abuse in sport before they turned 18. And we know, one, sexual abuse is underreported. So that
Oh yeah.
31%, that doesn't represent the true numbers out there,
Mm-mm.
especially young men, right? We know that sexual abuse among young men is much more prevalent than what is reported for a whole lot of reasons they don't
Mm-hmm.
coming forward. So among elite athletes, 31, 21%, massive numbers. The U.S. Center for SafeSport, which is a nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado, that is kind of this watchdog organization for the Olympic movement, where I spent 4 years as the VP for response and resolution. So I was over the organization's department that received and resolved thousands of allegations of abuse. We conducted some studies while I was there, and it was approximately 1 in 8 athletes were going to be subjected to sexual abuse before they turned 18, right? Again, you take that number and you put it in the context of how many kids are playing sports. That's a
Mm-hmm.
problem here in the US. But again, Canada did a study, right? 72% reported, upwards of 72%. So there was a bit of a range, but the high end of that range, 72% of athletes reported being subjected to emotional abuse. 30% sexual abuse, 21% physical abuse. That's in Canada. So that crosses the line up there. The UK did a similar study of 10,000 athletes who had reached adulthood. 65% indicated they were subjected to emotional abuse before they turned 18. 44% physical abuse, 35% non contact sexual abuse, more than 20% physical sexual abuse, right? And that's out of the UK. Then they did another study in Europe with Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium, and it was 72% indicated emotional abuse,
Gosh.
25% physical, 31% sexual. Like these are big numbers,
Oh, it's giving me
right?
the chills.
It's almost seems like it's setting up an impossible task for,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we're going to put a stop to it. But the reason I put these numbers out there is not to discourage people, right? It's not to say, look, man, this is such a pervasive problem. There's no place for sports in our society. I've already said I love sports. And my goal is not to end sports, it is to bring the recognition that is needed to the prevalence of abuse so that we can do something about it, right? When people get past the good, right? And what I mean by that is we often stop at how much we enjoy sports or how much,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, the benefits of sports are. We stop there and we don't take the next step in recognizing that, yeah, there can be bad with that good, right? What I'm trying to help people understand is those are not mutually exclusive concepts. We can love sports while recognizing we can make them safer. That's
Mm-hmm.
the problem, right? When you look at those numbers I'm talking about, and again, you talk about 25 million in the US alone playing sports every year. You start talking about how this is a global epidemic and just abuse is everywhere. It's a problem. And
Mm-hmm.
fortunately for us in the US, we had a few like really high profile, issues in sports come up over the last couple of decades with Nasser, and just the heinous acts with those young females in gymnastics and Sandusky and abusing all those, young football athletes, right? That kind of shined the light on it can happen at any level and anybody can be involved, right? And so I tell people all the time that that is what we have to understand. The bad is there. So how do we stop it? How do we prevent it? How do we recognize it? And that's part of what I've started doing, right? I start working with individuals and I start working with organizations in
Mm-hmm.
the country to do a few things. And it's education. You will just hear me talk about how important education is because it helps people build that knowledge base and feel empowered to
Yeah.
say something or do something or recognize something that again they may not have understood to be abuse. They may not have realized, right? And I tell people, if we move to just, sexually abusive acts, I tell people that it's not a single act, right? Sexual abuse, especially in the context of sport, is
Mm-hmm.
often, and that's the majority of situations, a process. Meaning, everybody's heard
Grooming.
exactly, everybody's heard,
Mm-hmm.
everybody's heard manipulation of youth to, the end goal of that abuser is to engage in sexually abusive acts with that minor or young adult. And if we know it's an act, I mean, a progression, right? A process
Right.
that leads to these acts of sexual abuse, that means to me more training, more education. We can get upstream, right? Maybe we can stop some, maybe we can prevent some of these situations from progressing all the way to a physically sexually abusive act because I assure you just we all can agree that has absolutely no place in society, no place in.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do more to understand those specific aspects. And I tell people all the time, that's why I love to train and work with parents to help them not only understand what grooming can look like, right? The acts that we see, right? Where you start to see people where it's isolation, right? Like they start to socially or physically isolate individuals. They start to have one-on-one contact, right? Outside of sport.
Mm-hmm.
They see gifting where they start to show special attention to a specific athlete, providing them, you know, gifts or like, hey, I'll coach you after hours, things like that, right?
Give
Start
you a
to
ride home.
Yeah, start to push boundaries. Not every act of that. That's what's so difficult about grooming.
Right.
individual who engages in that is grooming a child. Some of that is a coach who is trying to be a mentor and relate to
Sure.
athlete, but it's, we know that it can be grooming. So what we want to do is educate parents in a way that they can start to see those red flags pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Parents, and I work with organizations from a foundational base to understand those red flags, right? And what to do. And then,
So, so
yeah,
before we go further, let's introduce you and and tell us about your background, because I mean it's absolutely fascinating. And our topic really today, as you probably have guessed, is really talking about the abuse that's in sports. And it's one of those things that it's one of those areas. And this is another reason why I want to do the podcast, as I was mentioning, is that I want to be able to bring attention to people in areas that we wouldn't even really think of. And this is a real pervasive one. And one we can agree that we need to create some kind of definition of what the different abuses are, what they look like. But anyway, I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, because you really have a fascinating background and I love what you do. And so go ahead and share.
yeah, and that's my fault because as soon as I can delve into abuse in sports, I delve in, right? Because
I get it. I get
it's
it.
such a passion of mine because I've just worked in this arena for a while. So my background is I'm an attorney. I went to law school down at the University of Alabama, so Roll Tide. I went to undergrad down there, got a philosophy degree, and really started out as a public defender. So what I wanted to do out of law school is I had this job lined up even before I graduated, was work with individuals charged with crimes who are of, often people of color or lower socioeconomic status because I felt like it wasn't a great situation for them down in Alabama. So I did that for years, right? And I
Yeah.
loved the work, and it really set me on this path of I want to be an attorney who makes a difference, right? It turned me into this just public interest or social justice type attorney. That's what I wanted to do. And for the next, 7 or 8 years, I worked into a few different organizations and did some more criminal defense work in private practice and ultimately wound up at a small regional law firm in Alabama that where my book of business was what they call sexual abuse and molestation defense. And what that means is I was working with organizations who had employees or volunteers or someone associated with the organization who had been accused of, convicted of, alleged to have engaged in abuse of some sort of a vulnerable population, very often youth, the elderly, individuals with some level of disability. And I would work with those organizations through the civil defense practice and also getting their policies, procedures, everything up to where it needed to be. But that just was not what I wanted to do, right? It didn't take me long to realize, like, great, I had this experience of working in this sexual abuse field, but I didn't feel like I was really serving the greater good by working in civil defense. So ultimately, I moved out to Denver back in 2019 to join an organization called the U.S. Center for SafeSport, which a lot of people had not heard of. I had not heard of it at the time. It was just reading about it and learning about its mission that I was like, oh, this is something I can get behind. And what it was is a nonprofit that works in the Olympic movement, which is almost 12 million people in the U.S., to and abuse, right? It works on investigating and resolving allegations of abuse. It works on prevention and education training, and it works on policy development for large sporting organizations like U.S. Soccer, U.S. Hockey, organizations that serve hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of individuals. And I joined their organization and ultimately served for about 4 years as the vice president of response and resolution, which was the largest department of the center. And its sole task was to receive allegations of abuse and investigate and resolve those allegations. So when I talk about getting a look behind the curtain, I was one of those individuals who was reading thousands of allegations of abuse of all types, emotional, physical, sexual, throughout the Olympic movement. And that is the athletes you see in Tokyo, in Paris, in LA, to 7-year-old soccer players out on a local grassroots field, right? All of them are encompassed in this Olympic movement. And I did that for years. And it was tough work. It was. There was no doubt about
Mhm.
it. But it
Yeah.
really highlighted to me the need, right? And it highlighted how as an attorney who had worked in the sexual abuse field for years, was blind to just the sheer amount of
Mhm.
abuse and risk that lived in something I loved. Sports in the South, so important. Like a lot of places across, I had football pads on by the time I was 5 years old, right? I was playing soccer and baseball. Like, I mean, it was
Yeah.
every season was a new sport. These things were important to us, right? Football in Alabama, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people gathering to watch college football, right? Huge events for communities.
Mm-hmm.
Such a part of our identity. And it was really the first time in my life that I had gotten a real understanding of the pervasiveness of abuse and how much damage this is doing to people that and I had no idea. And so that really sent me down this path I'm on now, right? I spent years at the center doing everything I can and could to help the Olympic movement. And after about 4 years, or it was closer to 5, I realized there were still so many gaps that existed in areas of sport, right? Where it's
Mm-hmm.
large sport organizations outside the Olympic movement, or maybe organizations that, don't have access to the center's resources, that I can take what I've learned over these years and help again get to that kind of mission of doing good
Mm-hmm.
and help these groups. So that's now what I do now. I joined with a law firm here in Denver to create a consulting practice that focuses exclusively on helping organizations prevent and respond to abuse. And I will tell you, the majority of our clients are nonprofits, and we work with them to ensure that their stakeholders and that their staff and everybody has appropriate training, that they have the appropriate policies and procedures in place to create as safe of an environment as possible. And also that they have access to professionals who this is their background in case allegations are made, to ensure that they're appropriately handled. Because I do think we have a lot of work to do. And that, yeah, it's just become the mission of mine to really shine a light on the problem and do everything we can. Because I will tell you, when I sit down with people and I talk with them, there's not a single person that I've talked to that wants sports to go away,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And the majority I talk to, when I'm done, have an understanding that we, meaning everybody,
Mm-hmm.
a lot more to prevent and respond to abuse appropriately in the sporting world. I use this kind of hook to get people interested. I tell them this all the time now because I used to hear, "Well, I don't have a child in sport, so
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to happen." Or I coach my kids teams. I coach my kids teams, right? So I don't need real training or understanding because I'm in charge. I would never abuse my child or any other child. That's the vast majority of us, right? We would never do anything like.
Right.
And what I tell people is, I really want to get us to an understanding that abuse prevention, abuse response training is viewed as this in the same light as CPR and basic life-saving skills. What I
Mm-hmm.
tell people is, I'm CPR and BLS certified. I don't get certified because I'm expecting someone in the grocery store or the shopping mall or even one of my kids to need resuscitation, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I hope I go through my entire life without ever having to use those skills. But in the off chance that I need them, right? In the off
Mm-hmm.
chance that I come upon a situation where someone needs CPR, those basic life saving skills, I can assure everybody that I'll be ready and that I will make a big impact on that person's life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Abuse prevention, abuse recognition, and response training is the same type of thing. The hope is that you never need to say that is a problematic behavior. I need to step in, or this child is showing signs of potential abuse, which we can talk about in just a few minutes. But the idea behind it is you get trained, so you build that knowledge base. The team gets trained, the parents get trained, the organization gets trained.
Mm-hmm.
So if anything ever happens with your team, with another team, in your daily life and you see those red flags, you see it and you can do something about it. Just like CPR, just like BLS, you will have a profoundly positive impact on that individual's life who that you see may be subjected to abuse, but
Yeah.
also just the culture around it. And that's kind of the idea. And that's where this idea of starting this consulting group and coming on podcasts and working with anybody and everybody who will listen to me, get on the soapbox and talk about how, we can do better. That's
Mm-hmm.
something I tell my kids all the time, right? When they make a mistake, I'm like, it's okay. We can do better, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a community of fire and brimstone. It is, there's a problem. we're going to address it by doing better next time, right? And in the sports abuse world, it is working on our prevention, meaning education, making
Mm-hmm.
we have the right safeguards in place, but also training on how to, how to recognize it. And if you do recognize abuse, what should you do about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Steps, and that's really become the focus. And I imagine I'll be doing this as long as I can, right? Because the problem is much bigger than me. It will exist well after I am gone. So my hope is that I can push the needle in the right direction and just have a positive impact on sporting culture in the US and, as big of an audience we can get.
Right, right. I mean, it'd be nice for us to go to business, right?
Tell people that all the time. It would be
Yeah,
a wonderful thing if I had to look for a new line of work because
exactly. Exactly. But and like I said, when we had our meeting, it really made me think a lot. It really, it's an area that I never even thought of. I was not particularly in sports, and my son wasn't in sports, so I wasn't directly involved in it all the time, but my niece was,
you know,
and I had other people. And and when you talked about especially the amount of children that play sports every year and the percentage of abuse. And then there's the whole thing that we talked about where there's not like a book of, okay, this is exactly what abuse looks like. This is what it could look like. This is what grooming, like there's no outline for us. And it'd be nice, honestly, at this point in time, if we could come up with one, because that's part of the education. Because your definition and my definition of abuse could be one thing, and somebody else might not even see it at all. Like I was saying with my husband when I said to him, did coaches ever belittle you or yell at you? And back in the day, that wasn't considered abuse. That was coaching, right? But
100
today we know that that has a significant effect on children, especially when they're exposed to it over and over and over.
it absolutely. And I will tell you, like I said, sexual abuse tends to be more black and white.
Right.
Physical, emotional abuse, so difficult to identify because I mean, just a number of factors. And some of the big ones is it differs from sport to sport and
Ah.
from level to level, right? What
Mm-hmm.
like let's just talk about physical activities. What you're doing in a combat sport, right? Like a coach may make physical contact with an athlete if it's wrestling or it is, taekwondo or judo, right? There's physical contact. Boxing
Mm-hmm.
is necessary. Maybe not so much in a sport like table tennis or tennis or, so it's different. So, and then you talk about, okay, so what is appropriate with a 7-year-old boxer versus an Olympic athlete?
Yeah.
So it's so difficult because the definition of what is physical abuse or emotional abuse is not a fixed target. It's a moving target that depends on ages. It depends on level. It depends on sport, right? All of these different things. But
Yeah.
exactly what you're talking about is what we need, which is we have to start thinking about that. We have to start thinking about what is emotional or physical abuse in this context, right? Because exactly what you said with what was occurring 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago that was seen as just normal coaching and normalized, we know now may be abusive, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's also problems with having coaches who were coached in a certain way kind of repeat those codes. They're like, wait a second, like I didn't think it was abusive. I was coached this way.
And I was a great player. Look at me.
100%. So that is why I say we can do better as a society, as a sporting culture, because it's going to take a whole lot of people getting involved from a whole lot of different levels, whether it's parents, coaches at local clubs, leaders in organizations on a
Mm-hmm.
grassroots level, on a national level, to start to figure out exactly how, right? And I think even the U.S. Center for Safe Sport has started to create guidelines, right? The Safe Sport Code that says certain type things. If it has no beneficial beneficial result in sport, then it's, if it's punitive, then there's a good chance it's abusive, right? Like, hey,
Right.
go, I don't think you played very hard yesterday. I want you to run 100 laps or until you pass out, right? Or, you know what? I don't think you're trying very hard today, so you can't have water over the next 2 hours of this practice, right? We can start rank like, that has no place in sport, right? So we're doing
Yeah.
a better job of defining what I think are outliers that where physical and emotional abuse becomes clear, but
Right.
there still, even in our society, exists such a gray area where it is so difficult. And it takes an effort by so many people to start to define that out, right? Soccer.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to define what is unacceptable coaching practices in soccer, I'm going to need some soccer athletes, some soccer coaches, people from soccer organizations who are experts in that sport to come and work with somebody like me. And they're all willing to do it, right? This is, who is more of a prevention and a response professional. Like, I need their expertise as the soccer experts to come in and help them. And I'm slowly seeing where the culture is changing, right? You saw
Mm-hmm.
NWSL starting to highlight, even at the professional level, the abusive practices, right? You had the creation of the U.S. Center for SafeSport not that long ago, right? It was 2017 when it opened its doors. I tell people all the time, organized sports have been involved in this country a lot longer than the U.S. Center for SafeSport, which was a great step in the right direction to say, hey, there's a problem. We're going to do more to address it. And there's just, again, I think we can still do more. And yeah, and a part of it is the education of it's really difficult to address a problem,
Yeah.
have the knowledge base, the foundation, the understanding of what that problem is, what is potential abuse, how pervasive it is. And that's exactly right. That's why the starting point for me is always sports. This is how many kids play sports. This is how much good comes from sports.
Right.
Now let's talk about all the problems in sports to pique their interest to do exactly what you were doing when we first talked, which is like, man, this I didn't realize this problem. Now that I'm thinking about it, it makes sense. And
Mm-hmm.
dig in more and do their own research, start to take classes, whatever it can be, to kind of move that in the right direction. Because I think that is just, it's going to be slow. Progress is going to be slow just because it's systemic changes, but it is 100% possible. And what is funny is when you said, like, I started to think, like, my kids weren't, they weren't that necessarily big in sport, but I have a niece and a nephew, and I went, and I still do this sometimes when I give a training, especially in person. I'll have people raise their hands. Okay, who here still plays sports? And I'm usually training adults, so there'll be some hands up, but not as many. It's like, who have kids that play sports, that did or are still involved in sports? More hands go up. By the time I go through nieces, nephews, cousins, children that that play sports, very rarely do I have anybody in the audience with their hands down, right? Like,
Yeah.
sports are just everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
in our society. And that's why I can't get over the, pushing the importance of, I promise you, the training, the education that are available all over the place, right? Like, I'm not here to sell a service. I work with organizations mainly. There are trainings available online and resources available online for free for youth athletes, for parents of youth athletes, that I would encourage anybody to look up, right? The U.S. Center for Safe Sport has free adult and youth classes that will always be available. And I'm like, that's a great place to start, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
those those free resources out there, and that's the hope of a podcast like this, is that people hear it. If all they get out of it is like, man, this is a bigger problem than I ever would have thought, maybe it pulls them into doing a little bit of research, becoming a little bit more aware of, abusive tactics or
Mm-hmm.
methodologies that, abusers use, the signs of potential abuse, things to do if you see an abusive situation. Like, I tell people, like, those are all steps. I want to, the hope is you can be empowered to stop some of it, right? To hold
Mm-hmm.
holding your organization accountable. Maybe it's like, hey, I was doing some research and I was just reading some things online, and it says that we should have policies to prevent one-on-one communications between adult coaches and minor athletes. What do we have, right? Hold your organization accountable. Ask the questions to make sure that they're doing everything they can to, safeguard their youth athletes, right? And
Yeah, and that's a question I was going to have because I wasn't involved in sports like that. Um, and my son wasn't. So what kind of training do the coaches go through, or do they? I mean, I know it's parents coming in, right? And they've been an athlete themselves. They know the sport, they're good at it, and they coach the kids. What kind of, is there a background check? Is there training that is done? I mean, honestly, I don't know.
yeah, and so it depends a lot on where the coach is. So I will say that I think the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and the Olympic movement with the USOPC and the national governing bodies do a great job of setting their bar pretty high, right?
Mm-hmm.
Into background check policies, minimum levels of coaching related to what is abuse, what are, appropriate coaching practices, and they have to take these refreshers, right? And so coaches are required to take certain types of trainings, which I think is a great first step, right? Because the idea is it helps coaches not only recognize what they may be engaging in is problematic,
Right.
also maybe one of their peers, what they're engaging in is engaging in problematic. And I think that's a great first step. The requirement for training on, just
Mhm.
because your parent isn't there, there isn't training requirements for youth athletes, for good reasons, because it can be difficult training to go through. And also, that can be a personal choice between the parent and the child about what training they're going to take. But yeah, there are some standards set very high in the Olympic movement, and they can vary depending on what other, sporting organization or groups that you go through. But I will tell you, organizations like Positive Coaching Alliance, right? Groups, these third party groups that have gotten together and said, hey, we're going to change coaching tactics and methodologies across the board. They're out there and they're great. And I encourage people to look into those, right? And ask the
Mhm.
right questions. Do the coaches at your child's school or your child's, rec league or whatever, what coaching practices do they take? Because just like you know, it's not clear to everybody what kind of practices, what kind of coaching trainings, what kind of policies and procedures and organizations have. And
And as
part
parents, we go into this just trusting that all this has been set up and done and our kids are in a safe place.
100%, right? Because it's, again, go back to that looking past the good for the bad. Like, people, and the vast majority of people who spend their time coaching are doing it because they want to have a positive impact,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I coach my kids' team because I love seeing my kids play sports, and I want them to understand that sports are meant to be fun, and let's see all the benefits of sport. I, coming from a place of optimism, know that is, and I believe that is where most people come from,
Yeah.
but not everybody, right? You don't get to the numbers of abuse that I talk about if everybody was coming from that good place, right? And so,
And that's why they call it wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
like the fox in the hen house, that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like a predator, a true predator who's looking for a specific type of individual is going to be looking for access. Like, yeah, it can draw them to things like sports or
Mm-hmm.
organizations. But as a parent, yeah, that's a step in the right direction. Is holding your organizational accountable. Know the right questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
What policies and procedures are in place, because they can help, right? I will always say that the right policies, the right procedures, the right trainings help so much, because we know, again, sexual abuse is a process. And the more training we make, the stricter the policies and procedures are that are in place, create environments that are not conducive to abuse. And that does so much in helping weed out and prevent those abusers. Hey, this is a place where I can go and get access to kids. Instead, they take a step back and say, there's too many policies and procedures in place. They're
Too
going to
many
be,
protections in place.
I've got to go somewhere else, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the hope is one day there's nowhere for them to go, right? Because that conduct has no place in sports or anywhere else. So that's just part of it. I tell people all the time, like, we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Organizations are helping move the needle in the right direction. That's why I got involved in this. It's not because there aren't people in this space. It's because I think there need to be more people in this space.
Yes.
There needs to be more work done in this space, more acknowledgement, more professionals out there who are passionate about it, saying that
Mm-hmm.
we can do better, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we in front of, audiences, and just really kind of get their buy-in, and get them as a parent, as an athlete, as a coach, club administrator, as a volunteer. I mean, it's just endless categories of people who are involved in sports, right? Spectators, it's everybody. It doesn't, like, it's unbelievable. And like I said, by the time I get through my trainings and I ask those questions about who in some way has some connection to sport, very rarely do I walk out of a training with, a lot of people with any hands down, because they're like, oh yeah, it's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Yeah, it's right. I do have some involvement in sport. It may be
Mm-hmm.
a little less direct than the person, but it's the perfect reason to make sure that you just spend a little bit of your time, right? As much time as you can, getting the free, like, start with the free resources, the training, you just Google it, right? You'll see all of the different resources that are available out there for abuse prevention. And that is just a huge step in the right direction. Every time
Right.
you didn't think that it was as big of a problem as it was, starts to understand and starts to get a little bit more information, that is a huge step in the positive direction. And like I said, all those negative impacts we mentioned early on, the health issues, the academic issues, the mental health issues, right? We can do better in reducing all of that, right? We know 25 million kids play sports, and I keep coming back to that number because it's just so big.
That's huge. That's
I want
huge.
I want to do everything I to minimize and limit how many of those kids come out of sport with self-esteem issues, with eating disorders, right? Like with depression, with anxiety, all of those different things. Like, we can do better at limiting those, and that's just become my mission. And luckily, it's been really well received. It's been really, kind of just reinforces and reinvigorates my belief that it's not because people don't care. It's not because people don't want to help.
They just don't know. They
Ex-
don't know. And so let's talk about that. So as a parent, because the story that keeps coming to my mind that I could see happening and it being so common is, your child starts playing sports and the coach starts bringing them home, right? And
Yeah.
the coach starts paying a lot more attention to your child. And it would be really easy for a parent who's working, who's busy, without thinking about all this stuff that we're now learning. But they realize, oh, this coach, he's paying a lot of attention to my child must be really special. He must see something in this child, my child that I don't see. And so me right away, I would be on alert, but I'm in a different place, right? But most parents, I could see how that could be so innocent. So what are some of the things that parents should start looking for?
Yeah, and so speaking from potential tactics, we'll kind of start with that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what I see in potential behaviors that would raise, we'll call it an orange flag, right? Not necessarily like, oh my goodness, this coach is grooming my child, but things to be on the lookout for.
It's on your
That,
radar. They're on your radar
yeah,
now.
that's
Mm-hmm.
what I tell people, right? Like start to look at these things, and some of the big ones, right, that I see the most of, which are things that organizations are really trying to start to get a handle on one-on-one communications,
Yeah.
right? Like when a coach is directly communicating with an athlete via text, via email, via Snapchat, whatever medium people are using nowadays, be aware of that, right? Is it really appropriate for an adult coach to be communicating one-on-one with an athlete, right? What I encourage parents to do is to really set the boundaries early on and say, you know what, if you can 100% contact my child, just include me on those communications.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
That's what I was thinking.
yeah, just include me on those communications. And most
Mm-hmm.
coaches will be like, no problem. Absolutely. Because most of these communications are absolutely benign and they're,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we change practice from 4 to 4:30, or make sure you bring, you know, certain types of studs for your cleats because it's going to be wet outside. That's a lot of that, right? But setting those boundaries early on, because that also helps when if you set that boundary and that coach goes outside of that boundary, right? And they start communicating one on one, that really becomes kind of
That's a
like,
red flag.
why are you not communicating with me? Why are you
Mm-hmm.
communicating directly with my child even though I asked you to include me on those communications? That's beneficial, right? And what we see is the isolation is another big one. So one-on-one communications often move into kind of isolating, meaning, they're pulling that child away from whether it's their friend, they're spending more and more time with the coach, right? So in training situations, what you see is, they stop hanging out with their friends and they stop practicing more and more and more because the coach and it's one-on-one practices again, right? More and more.
Mm.
It's, they're being pulled away from their, social support groups, their friends, right? That can be an issue, right? But it's hard because, like you said, your child may be really talented and really benefit from those one-on-one trainings, but there's a way to just again be aware. I tell people all the time, contact out of sport is a big one for me. That's the
Mm-hmm.
one where I start to see the boundaries between a coach athlete relationship become blurred with a personal, like a different type of relationship, is when that coach starts having contact outside of the context of sport, right? And you can tell all of these they kind of blend together, one-on-one communication,
Yeah.
isolation, contact out of sport. They're all coming from the same kind of area. But yeah, so you start to see communications between the coach and the athlete that are unrelated to sport, right? That start asking questions that are just more about the youth's personal life or just become more friendly, right? That can be a bit of a concern, right? Because again, as a coach, your main purpose is to train that athlete within the context of sport. So I say, be on the lookout for communications that are outside the context of sport. And then you pair that with one-on-one communication. So you have a coach, for example, who's texting an athlete outside the context of sport individually, right? So again, you start putting these things together, those flags start to group together and like, okay,
Yep.
this is a bit of an issue. And this kind of feeds into almost the next topic, which is what do you look for in the athlete or the youth? Like one of the
Yeah.
things I always tell people when it comes to grooming and manipulation is look for
Mm-hmm.
changes in behaviors, right? Look for changes in behavior in your child. Like no one knows your child like you do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Start to see shifts in the way they act, that can also be kind of a red flag for me. But those are like four of the big topics that I can say that I saw as the most concerning factors. But kind of like what you were talking about, right? Like sometimes it's a coach trying to help, right? Because they got a busy
Right.
parent and the parent can't pick up the
Mm-hmm.
child and take them back and forth to practice. And a lot of organizations now have started to implement waivers and things where, and it's not really waivers, it's more consent forms. I misspoke there, where they're like, okay, we're going to get the parent more involved just so they know, right? Make it more official so the coach knows that this is the limitations of the travel and,
Right.
transportation. So there are ways to keep that coach because what I tell people all the time is I don't want to destroy the coach athlete relationship.
Mm-mm.
It can be so beneficial, right? Like I
Yeah.
still keep up with my coaches to this day. Like they helped me immensely when I was a youth, right? And did all of the positive things that sports can do. So we're not trying to tear down that coach athlete relationship. What we are trying to do is put those safeguards up to keep it as safe as possible, right? To make sure that we promote a safe environment so that the coach, you know, it's fulfilling for a coach to be able to really work with and help, nurture an athlete and watch them
Mm-hmm.
become successful in sport. Like it's a great thing. Like I love it, even at the young level, and it's great for the athlete to have access to a coach who is a true mentor, right? Who can help share these lessons in sport and really help them build that sense of community, that even the discipline, all the things that come along with it. But we can put some safeguards up to do it the right way. And so yeah, so your listeners out there, I would say that look out for those four things. One-on-one communication, isolation, contact outside the context of sport, and changes in behavior
Mm-hmm.
are four good like ways to start. Right, you do a little bit of research out there. I think those are the things that will often come up. You'll see in different researches accepted by different organizations as being some big indicators that you may just want to step in or really pay more attention to some of
Mm-hmm.
those would be the four I'd recommend.
Because I was just sitting here thinking, and I know this would be true with a coach that is coaching a team and a coach that's coaching a person. So for instance, like in gymnastics, right? And Dr. Nasser, we brought that up, but you've got a coach who is, that the parents hire to help this child become an Olympic athlete gymnastics, right? And so they are forced to be alone with that child a lot.
Yes.
And so that's a whole nother
Yeah, you're talking
situation.
100%. Individual sports, individual trainings, and team sport,
Yeah.
100% necessary, right? Think about the opportunities that are offered to athletes who get college scholarships, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are able to go to college on a scholarship or compete, good Lord, for their country at an Olympic level. Like just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's huge. And one-on-one trainings absolutely play a big impact on that. And I'm not going to say that there shouldn't be one-on-one trainings available because I do think that can have a great impact. But
Right.
set those same type of set out boundaries that you say are important, right? So if it is going to be one-on-one training, maybe the one-on-one training happens in a place where the training is observable, meaning like there are other adults training in the space. You, as the parent, observe it, right? We know Nasher was able to abuse these young women in front of others, so it is not a
Yeah, there
per
were other people that were involved and kept their mouth shut.
or
That's what
just
infuriates me even more.
oh, that's terrible. But people who didn't recognize it, right? And so I tell people it's not a perfect solution, but it's
Yeah.
a step in the right direction, right? Limiting the one-on-one contact in the context of maybe one-on-one coaching, but maybe it's not one-on-one coaching in an isolated area where there are
Mm-hmm.
people physically present, right? The communications is big, right? Especially on one-on-one. I can imagine
Yeah.
there's communication back and forth between that coach and that
Yeah.
athlete. They're giving them tips. They're saying, "Hey, I've seen coaches like record videos, and like I was reviewing the video, and I saw that there was, you could improve on this or that area of, your sport." And yeah, you want the coach to be able to engage in that conversation, that
Mm-hmm.
communication with the athlete. But again, maybe it's with the parent on that communication
Mm-hmm.
so that they know that it's not going to extend outside the context of sports. So yeah, so it is not easy, right? And that's what I tell people. It's not as easy as, the people who groom and manipulate athletes with the intention of engaging in sexual abuse are very good at disguising
Mm-hmm.
behaviors, right? We know that.
Yep.
And so it's not as simple as, oh, this coach is just going to announce to the world that he's grooming this athlete for sexual abuse. It's difficult. But the right thing to do, the first step is building up, like your as a parent, your knowledge base, right? Thinking about the things you can do to set safeguards that may not be there, right? If you're hiring a private coach, right, they're going to be operating completely outside the rules of a lot of these safety organizations. So what can you do, to set some boundaries to help safeguard? And they're out there, right? And you can do them in the way that won't destroy the coach athlete relationship, right? The publicly observable, the communications, keeping an eye on keeping it within the context of sport, making sure all that happens in it. Like I said, I think it can be done, and I think it'll have a huge impact on these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that too. If you tell a coach that you want to be in on the communication and he or she is not willing to do that, you have your answer.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a potential red flag. It's, because
Yeah.
that coach would never be like, "What? I'm not including you as the parent on my communications with your minor athlete." No, so that would be a concern of mine, just like it would be a concern if the coach agrees to it, but then I find out that they're going outside of that and they're having
Mm-hmm.
communications with my child or my minor athlete without including me, even though they had agreed to do it. It's again setting those boundaries. So if something goes outside those boundaries, again, it becomes a bigger issue, right? Like if maybe that orange flag becomes red, but you're like, wait, why exactly are you saying these things, or why are you not communicating with me directly? And the idea is, since we know it's a process, stopping it before it becomes physical sexual abuse, right? And the
Right.
next step in that direction is, again, understanding some of those, things to be on the lookout for, right? And so I think there are some resources out there. They don't live in where I do think we have to do better is we need to have some of these studies and you know Dr. Jeglich out of the John Jay Criminal Justice College out of SUNY University put together a great resource about like the green, yellow, orange, red flags of like grooming behaviors. We need to do more of translating that into the sport world, right? Sport
Right.
is very niche, and she's a great researcher up there. And I would absolutely encourage anybody listening to this to check out some of those resources because they are beneficial. I want to see more of that being developed in the sporting specific world, right? Where so we can give more resources to parents, to everybody involved. Like in the context of sport, this is more or less concerning than you would typically
Oh,
think.
right.
So I think we're moving in that direction. It's just again, it's a big, big change, and it's a big shift in our thinking with regards to sports. But I'm confident, optimistic we're going to get there. Like I said, every time I do
Yeah.
a podcast, every time I do a training, every time I just have a conversation with someone, it always ends with me almost always ends with me coming away going, all right, that's one more person that,
Yep.
that gets it now. That's one more person that I think is going to, hopefully say something to somebody else or spend a
Mm-hmm.
little time looking into this. And
I've
that's,
been talking to everybody about our conversation. I'm not kidding. It was just so impressive. And the one thing that comes to my mind too, as a parent, two things that could also help is always listen to your intuition. If you feel that something is off, all you have to do is be curious and just start asking questions. And, if start with your child even and just make sure that, how they're doing and checking in on them. And then if you have to go to the right places to ask the right questions. And if somebody's pushing back on that, you need to investigate that even more. But, your gut will tell you, like you said, you know your child better than anybody else. and you need to listen to your gut. And maybe you're wrong, but what if you're right?
Yes, 100%. I could not agree more. And I think an involved parent is a great thing, right? Like,
Mhm.
and what I tell people is get that training, start to build your understanding, your curiosity, so that if something were to ever happen or something may look, start to occur, right, in your child's life or in another child's life,
Yeah.
the impact could be just monumental. Speaking from just a sexual abuse, lane here, we know that survivors of sexual abuse, often delay disclosure. And recent studies have shown that they delay disclosure by up to 4 decades at the most. That's the most common time frame of delayed disclosure comes out in the of survivors' 50s. So for decades, they have
They're
internalized
suffering.
that trauma, that abuse, and they have,
Hmm.
I don't, those numbers make me think I'm not doing enough. I've got to do more to prevent anyone in our society from living with that, from suffering that initial trauma that is abuse, but then living with just that burden for the next 4 decades. It's just unbelievable to me. And I think, again, every time I have a conversation like this, every time I get in front of a single person or a group, it I can see it. Like it's one piece at a time, maybe a small move in the right direction, but it's a move in the right direction. And I couldn't agree more that, yeah, you're a parent, right? If you're a parent or you're an aunt or you're a cousin or you're a coach or a volunteer, understanding what could be the warning signs of that grooming or manipulation is a big deal. But then also understanding some of the things to look out for within the child or the youth or the young adult themselves. Right? I tell parents like educate yourself on that as well, right? And if I was to boil it down, I usually look for, that changes in behavior is a big one, right? Like
Hmm.
early on, and it's like, well, what constitutes a change of behavior? And it's like, well, that's difficult for me to answer. That's where I lean on you as the parent. You know your child better than
Right.
anybody else. You can recognize those changes in behavior. Some of the things I point to though are increased physical injuries, right? Can be an indication of physical abuse, right? We see the overtraining, we see, dehydration, just different types of physical injuries occurring at more frequency. What I've seen a lot though is avoidance, right? And so avoidance of a particular person or a place. Maybe they're trying to skip practice. They don't want to go to practice. They refuse to go in the locker room, or they're really nervous about going in the locker room. Maybe that's an indication of bullying or hazing. So be on the lookout when initially they didn't have it, and now there's been a shift, and they're avoiding certain things like, you know, other players, certain coaches, certain areas, right? Ask them why. Like you said,
Hmm.
kind of inquire about that. I've seen kids lose, their sleep habits are interrupted, inability to concentrate. That kind of feeds into what we were talking about earlier about those academic issues where they tend to suffer because of acts of abuse. I've also seen a loss of interest. It almost looks like a burnout or quitting teams, right? Like we've seen it where kids love their for years. They just absolutely love
Hmm.
a whole lot of reasons they may decide to move on from that sport, but that can sometimes be an indication that there's some type of issue within the team or with the staff. So look for that loss of interest or, just the burnout as a professional, we say burnout all the time, but just they don't want to play sports anymore. They quit and you can't figure it out because for the life of you, you thought they loved gymnastics or hockey or some sport like that. So be on the lookout for things like that. And for me as a parent, of young children, right? I look for things like my stomach hurts, right? I have a headache. I don't want to go to practice today, and it's a frequent occurrence and they're putting it in their own language, right? They're not going to come to you and say, I don't want to go to practice because I'm being bullied or I'm being hazed,
Yeah.
or someone is doing something inappropriate to me, right? Like my youth, I don't know that he would be able to put that into words just because it's
Hmm.
right. And so for me, I look for things like him coming to me and say, "Hey, Dad, I don't want to go to practice. I got a stomach ache." Well, if that happens 3 weeks in a row, I'm starting to go like, "Hey, man, like, what's going on? Talk to me. Is there something that is there a reason behind this? Right? Is it more than just he didn't like lunch and your stomach's hurting? Right? Have those conversations because I think those are the big ones for me. Right? The avoidance, the fear, the lack of interest, the changes in behavior like sleep patterns or concentration or things like that really can again just give you an indication that you may need to ask more questions. You may
It's
need
an
to,
orange flag, like you said. It's an
yeah,
orange flag to kind of look for.
yeah, because again, I mean, kids change, right? We know they get older, they change. They may be out of sport for a whole lot of reasons. but it's worth asking, right? It's worth asking
Yeah.
if it is starting to show some of those signs, right? And then again, like you start to see issues with, you know, depression, anxiety. It can be the results of, you know, mental, physical, or sexual abuse can be really, really like invasive. They can have just dramatic impacts on people. So again, I just encourage everybody to equip yourself with the knowledge and with the tools to hold organizations accountable, hold your coaches accountable, recognize it. If there is, you know, signs there, like start to like this doesn't seem right, right? Like it will empower that intuition that you may have. It'll help you, you know, build on
Mm-hmm.
it. And then, you know, the last thing I like to encourage people to do is build up your understanding of what you can do in these types of situations where you recognize, you know, there may be an abusive situation or something going on, especially if it's happening out there in public place or something. You know, so I do trainings, whether it's bystander intervention and things like that. Just really the goal is to empower people. Like, okay, so you see something that you may be that's caused you concern. Maybe it's an action, right? You see a coach screaming, yelling, or engaging in some kind of physical contact with a child that you're like, that's inappropriate. Or start to see some of those orange or red flags with your child or another child. Like, what steps do you take? What do you do? Right. And I always think bystander intervention is a great starting place, but understanding the resources out there, like who you can contact, who are the professionals in this space, are absolutely, you know, a next step for people. It used to be see something, say something. That's what I used to hear a lot. See something, say something. Like if you see something, say something. And a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
took that to mean like make a report, talk to police, talk. And I'm like 100%. I like to take it a step further, right? I like to say see something, do something, right? And the do something maybe saying something. That's one thing, but
Mm-hmm.
also understand you can have a direct interaction, right? You can go to the organization or the coach or the individual involved and say, hey, I didn't think that was appropriate, right? You can get other people involved. You can document the situation.
Mm-hmm.
There are things to do. So I often issue a challenge to people of like, I love see something, say something, but I want to see something, do something. I want to empower you to have to be able to take some next steps, to be able to, you know, stop it, prevent it, recognize. Like I said, sometimes it's just people coming from a place of lack of understanding. They're not, their intention is not to
Right.
harm. You may be able to just have a conversation with that individual. So yeah, so I'd encourage people to do all of that, right? It's a big task. You know, it's a lot to ask for, to say, hey, you need to go start to have an understanding of what is abuse. Then you need to figure out, you know, you know, what are the warning signs of abuse. Then you need to figure out what you need to do if an abuse situation happens. And that can seem like a tall task or a big ask. And I that's when I issue another challenge and say, well, what kind of impact do you think you can have on somebody's life if they're being abused or potentially they're being groomed, or and you're able to
Mm-hmm.
come in and stop it either through, you know, prevention and education, holding an organization, individual, all those things we talked about today. It'd be huge, especially knowing how much trauma comes with abuse, right? And I tell people like sexual abuse, we know the trauma involved with that. I have seen the trauma, emotional and physical abuse, right? The mental health issues and things that happen, and the eating disorders and the body image issues, and we've seen you know, just the self harm, all of the different things that come with it. So all those different types of abuse, none of them have a place. And I fully believe, first step is just becoming more educated on what it is, how to recognize it, and what we can do in response.
Mm-hmm.
That's, you know, that's hopefully the message people get out of this.
You know, it's interesting when you were mentioning about it takes someone who's been sexually abused for decades before they report it or before they say anything. You told me that when we were doing our pre-interview, and that stuck with me. And I went back and I thought, you know, and because I did the childhood abuse healing workshop for 8 years with women, and that is absolutely true. And there's
Yeah.
some that have gone farther. There was a woman in our group that was 75 years old and had never shared it, not even with her husband. So that is very common. And this, you know, the thread of that is the shame,
Yeah.
right? Because
Shame.
I didn't start really talking about my abuse, and I was not sexually abused. I was, you know, I didn't really start doing this until I was in my 50s.
Just think about that, right? Like think about
It's a long time to suffer.
all the additional like trauma and burden that comes with that, right? And I
Oh
tell
yeah.
so the overarching goal, like one of the big goals, like the high, in the clouds kind of goal is you hear people and they talk about like this is a safe space, right? You can talk to us and you see signs, this is a safe space. And, you know, but that means the inverse is true that a lot of people feel like there are a lot of places out there that aren't safe. And as a culture, as a society,
Hmm.
are we a safe space holistically? And we can do better about that, right? I don't feel like, you know, and as I'm not a survivor of sexual abuse. I've never been sexually abused. So all this information I get is when I can talk to a survivor who is willing to share, right? And I can learn from the trauma that they've been through and that they continue to work through. And I tell them like, thank you for sharing. And it helps me. It helps my understanding, right?
Hmm.
That we've got to get to a place where, yeah, the shame, the stigma, those attached to it, like we can do more, right? We can do better as a society, ensuring that survivors doing everything we can to make survivors feel like that's not the case anymore, right? And it should never be the case that someone feels ashamed or that there's any kind of stigma or what's going to happen to me. Like that, like they're dealing with enough. That should be the last thing on their mind. And unfortunately, that's not the type of
No.
society we live in right now, right? There still is all of that, those concerns with people coming forward. So I think, again, that's another kind of challenge, right? So we can do better. We can do better about learning the impact of trauma, the effects of trauma, how to make our society a safe place where
Hmm.
survivors understand and feel like they can come forward without any type of repercussion because that's what I want, right? I want them to be able to do that because for me, as a person who's become a professional that often responds to abuse, meaning is able to, holding an individual accountable or working with organizations, like I want as many people coming forward because to eliminate abuse, I have to have a real understanding of how much is out there. And we know that it's still underreported because people
Oh
don't
yeah.
coming forward. And so changing that has to be like a high level goal because if we change that, if people feel, and you saw it with the Me Too movement, right? People saw it and they felt more comfortable coming forward.
Hmm.
We found out about things happening for decades that people were not coming forward, but we saw that
Yeah.
in that just empowerment and people found their voice and survivors found their voice and it was a way for us to make big strides in the sexual abuse.
Huge.
Yeah, and so we saw what happens when survivors feel empowered. So how do we continue that, right? How do we continue working on that as a society to do better to ensure that survivors feel more empowered? Because as a safety professional, I know that's a great way to make big strides. And there's no easy answer to that, right? These are systemic issues that extend all facets of life, like
Yep.
across the globe. And my focus has just become that sports piece because again, it's a passion of mine. I've been able to take some of the experience that I've gathered over the years and apply it to an area that is very important to me, that I enjoy very much, that that I've come to realize that can do some bad things as well. So that's where it's kind of led me down a path and asked me 6 or 7 years ago. I'm like, what? I'm going to be doing? Well, no, you're crazy. I'm still going to be in the courtroom litigating defense cases. That's what I'm going to be doing. And I can tell you right now, I couldn't go back just because this has become
Your
such a
passion.
yeah, it's just such an important mission that I see and the need is out there, and it's just something that that I'm going to do for as long as I can.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it. I don't know if we have anything like that here in San Diego, but I would love to have something here and I would love to be involved. I am serious. I just had no idea until we had our conversation. And you're right, it is so important. I mean, think about it. 25 million children a year, right?
Yeah, that's how many play sports in the U.S., and that's a conservative estimate, right? That's estimates based on national surveys. That's estimates that I don't think are in a lot of dispute. And when you think about
Mhm.
it, it's like, well, good Lord, yeah, how many play sports in school? How many play sports in aftercare programs? It's like
Oh
sports
yeah.
everywhere. So you talk about as a conservative estimate, 25 million kids play sports. And we know just looking at those surveys, like the prevalence of different types of abuse, it's like it really makes you take a step back and say, man, like we can do better. We can do more,
Yeah.
right? And I think we're moving in that direction. One of the other things I have to make sure happens, right, that's so important to me is that we don't let this movement of sports safety that's happening again on a global scale, but I'm here in the US, die down just because there hasn't been a big incidence of abuse in
Right.
the media, right? Like I hate seeing or thinking of the idea that our interest in ending abuse wanes because there hasn't been a big media, like big story that hit the media that
Right.
everybody's attention to it. That isn't
It's
happening.
it's like the Dr. Nasser was a one-off kind of thing. It was just this one, and it's not a one-off kind of thing. And it is, and we do need to do a better
Yeah,
job at creating a safe place for anybody who's been abused. Because I
well,
know I kept my mouth shut until I was in a safe space.
yeah. And so we want those safe spaces to be everywhere at all times, right?
Right.
Yeah. And it's a disservice to survivors. It's a disservice to our youth to not ensure that we're doing everything we can because it is such a wide scale issue. It demands and deserves our attention, our time, whatever we can give it. And that's turned into, again, my professional passion at this point. And so that's what I do. I work with organizations of all shapes and sizes, specifically sports and youth serving organizations. Right? I was like, look, even to me, this seemed like an impossible task. It's like, where do I start? How do I begin? There's just so much. It's
One
everywhere.
step at a time.
Yeah. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be hyper focused on where I know that my experience think I can make the biggest impact with, and that's sports organizations and youth serving organizations, right? So those are the groups that I work with pretty much exclusively across the country, and it's for that very reason. Like you said, it's such a big problem, and so many people are impacted by it that I was like, okay, I'm going to make an impact here. And like, some days it seems like an impossible task, right? Because
It's
it's
so
so
big. It's like untapped.
yeah, it's like one step forward, two step back.
Yeah.
But I've started having conversations with safety professionals around the U.S. and even up in Canada on how we can work together to raise the bar
Yeah.
across sports, right? So how do we, as the professionals, right, as the people often the public would turn to us and say, hey, you've been in this space for 10 years, you've got to be the expert, right? How do we take our information, our expertise, our experience, and use that to raise the bar in California, in Alabama, in Denver, Colorado, right? Cities, states, just kind of across the board. And it's, again, that's where I get a little bit reinvigorated because I have those conversations with those professionals and they're like, 100%, I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I tell people all the time, we're not competition, right? Meaning I'm not taking your clients, you're not taking mine. That's the wrong way to look at this.
Right.
We will be more successful. We will have a bigger impact together than we could ever have as individuals. So I tell people like it's an all ships rise. Let's raise the bar for everybody. I want that safety professional in Tupelo to be as good as the safety professional in New York, right? Like let
Mm-hmm.
across the board, let's set the standards, let's raise the bar. And I'm confident and I'm optimistic that we'll get there. It takes a lot of work and it takes people willing to get into a new field, right? Like it's a new concept that sports, despite
Yeah.
abuse has been happening for decades upon decades, we're really just starting to come to terms with the pervasiveness of it and how much of a monumental task this will be. But like you said, it's one step at a time. And I tell people like I think it's up to the safety professionals. Like we burdened the survivors long enough with being the only voice about the problem.
Yeah.
But now it's time for those safety professionals, the ones who've gotten to look behind the curtain to say, okay, we can alleviate some of that burden. We can help push. We can push this in the right direction. The survivor voice is always so important. But that doesn't mean that we just have to saddle them with this additional burden themselves. We can do more as the professionals in the space to keep the movement moving forward. That we can, hopefully, every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, can look back and say, all right, we've moved in the right direction. It's a
It's
little bit better.
making a difference.
It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. So hopefully, my kids and my kids' kids, and however
Yeah.
far that line goes, every generation it gets better and better. So
Yeah.
yeah, we
Because we
eliminate
still we still have coaches and stuff that are kind of coaching the old way, right? So we kind of have to work
100.
through that.
100%. There's a whole lot of work to be done, right?
Yeah.
And that's again why you have to keep the movement, right? Have to keep it going forward because it's going to take so many people to make this, difference. And that's why I say again, we're all part of the same movement, and it's
Hmm.
our responsibility to keep it going. And I will not, you know, stop. I'll do everything I can to keep it going. And again, it's always a little bit of a concern to me that as public attention, it's very difficult to hold the public's attention, and it waxes and wanes. And does it kind of die down because there hasn't been a big Me Too,
Hmm.
or there hasn't been a huge issue in the media like Sandusky or Nasser? And, yeah, those are massive, massive sexual abuse scandals. But the one sexual abuse act is happening to one child in, one city. It has no place, right? And we have to do everything to stop it. And, it's still happening. And yeah, I think the more we get our understanding up of how pervasive an issue this is, but then also really educating people on how they can do something about it. Like,
Hmm.
I do think most people come from a great place, and if they knew what to do, if they knew how to recognize something, they would do more. And so my goal
Yeah.
is to get the message about how dire of a need it is, and yeah, and just keep getting more and more people involved in sports safety, and just youth safety across the board.
Well, I'm jumping on your bandwagon. I am not kidding. I am serious because when we hung up from our Zoom call, I was just like, I want to get involved because nip it before it turns into something, educate and I think empowering the parents and empowering the kids, giving the kids a voice and having that relationship with your child. I mean, I had this with my son that he can come to me about anything.
Yeah,
And I even reminded him of that just recently, and he's 33 years old. Honey, you can talk to me about anything. There's no judgment, it's a safe place, and create that environment for your children so they can come to you when there's a concern. And you can work with them and help them articulate what the problem is. Because like you said, they can't always articulate what's going on. They know something's not right, but they don't understand what.
100%. And I tell people that's even, some of the workshops, the training, the education I do is directed at the youth themselves, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it varies from age to age, but the idea is, how can we most empower that age group, right? To recognize potential abuse, to articulate potential abuse. The older they get, to
Yeah.
empower them to do something about it, right? To stop the bullying, the hazing, the physical, the emotional, the sexual abuse, right? To start shifting the culture in their locker room, and working with them, like, because I hear it a lot,
Mm-hmm.
like, look, I didn't say anything because I'm a kid and nobody would believe me, right? Or it's not going to make a difference. And I hate to hear that, right? Because it could make a difference. And I want that youth to feel empowered to come forward. And then, like you said, that how do we ensure that when they do come forward, they are taken seriously, that the right steps are taken? And I live by education and prevention. Like, it's so important in creating a safer environment and instituting systemic change. And yeah, I think there are a lot of ways for parents to get involved, for athletes, like I said, resources to be offered to athletes or youth to empower them to feel like they have a voice, that they'll be listened to if they come forward, right? And equipping, those people they may come forward to with the tools and understanding to really how to take in that information, and yeah, what to do when it comes to you, right? I
Yeah.
a lot, right? I always hate when I talk to a youth and they're like, or even an adult who as a youth came forward and people were like, I just didn't feel like they believed me. Nothing happened, right? Like,
Yeah.
and we still live in that world, and I think that's part of the change that has to happen. There's a whole lot of change that has to happen on a whole lot of different levels, and I've really kind of zeroed in on some of the things we've been talking about, which is additional education, education, education. Who can I educate? How can I educate?
Mm-hmm.
How can I get the message out there? And then safeguards, working with organizations to put those preventative safeguards in place to make it a less conducive environment for abuse. Like, I've really focused a lot of time here recently in the last 6 months, like that, on those specific things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working just in response, meaning just we're reactive and we don't do something until something happens.
Yeah.
To me, it will always be there because we have to have those appropriate procedures and processes in place. But how can we get more preventative? How can we be more forward thinking and,
Proactive.
yeah, hopefully stop some of this stuff before it happens? And that's where I really started working with organizations and just, again, the community in general to get their understanding up, to hopefully get ahead of some of this abuse and see if we can stop it. Because I don't care what type of abuse it is, I don't care what format it's occurring in. None of it has a place in sport,
Mm-hmm.
place in youth serving organizations. None of it has a place in our society in general. So that's,
Mm-mm.
like I said, I'll continue to work on weeding that out, preventing it, and and reacting to it when necessary, and as long as I can work as a professional in this space.
I love it. I love it. Seriously. Well, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, shoot me an email at bclick@emfig.com. Just shoot me a message. And I tell people all the time, I want to be a resource to anybody and everybody who needs it. So I don't care if you're a parent, I don't care if you're a sports administrator, if you're the leader of an organization, if you have questions or you need just somebody to bounce an idea off of, or anything, reach out. Because again, what I've learned over the years, what I have just kind of gathered and experienced, it is unique, right? Not everybody's going to have the opportunity to have done what I've done, and I want to be a resource to anybody and everybody who needs it. So I encourage people, just shoot me an email, right? So bclick@emfig.com, and I'll absolutely engage in a dialogue with you, because again, any person I can help is a step in the right direction. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'll see you for sure.
Well, I was going to ask you, what do you want to leave our listeners with? And I think you left them with some really good information, but do you have anything to add? Because I think that's great. And we'll have all your contact information
Yeah,
as well so people can reach out to you.
absolutely. I think for me, the message I end on, right? The message I end on all the time in my trainings and podcasts, anything I do, is just understand you can make a difference, right?
Mm,
As a player, as a coach, as a spectator, as a peer, you can make a difference, right? And a really positive difference. And so let's work together to put you in the best position to make that difference, right? And we do that through understanding the resources that are out there, understanding what you can do to gain information to really, again, be in the best position to help someone who may really need it. So yeah, so I would leave that with that. Like, just understand that anybody listening can make a difference. Like, I do not want to ever diminish an individual's ability to make a real difference. And that, I don't care if you're 10 years old, if you're 50 years old, if you're 75 years old, like what your involvement is, there's an opportunity there. And yeah, so that would be what I leave everybody with.
well, thank you so much. This has been great. I mean, and you and I are going to stay in touch for sure, because I just love this idea. And it's opening up my mind to just other areas, of educating children and educating parents, outside of sports. I mean, sports is huge.
It's all out there, right? And I tell people all the time, like, my expertise, my experience, kind of, I navigated that sports field, but there is so much we can do just in general, like you said, with youth, with abuse. And there are great organizations out there that, my ability to give them exposure is a wonderful thing, right? Because I know they're doing great work across,
Right.
and so yeah, so there's a lot of work to be done, and sometimes it seems like an impossible task. But that's why I end it with always saying, like, even though it seems like an impossible task, you as an individual, just even as an individual, can make just a profound impact in the right way. And I hope that I can provide those types of resources, or at least direct people in the right direction,
Hmm.
sources, and say, great, now I know a little bit more and I can have that. Right. A lot of times it's just getting in front of the right audience, because usually when I can put this information out there, it's just like you, people take a step back and go,
Yeah.
I didn't realize
Yeah.
I was one of those people. I was one of the people that, before I joined the U.S. Center for SafeSport, I had no idea. I wasn't
Hmm.
out there doing what I'm doing now, which is reading the research and the studies and all of that. And I'm going, no way. Like, abuse, okay, it's out there, but it's not as prevalent. And that now I know better, right?
Hmm.
Every time I get in front of somebody, every time I can get the message out there a little bit more, one more person, two more people, three more, who start to realize, start to understand that this is a more pervasive issue. Again, it's a step in the right direction, and sometimes
Hmm.
one step at a time. And I hope we can look back in, next year, the year after, and so to speak, and we start looking back at a generational level, and we can say, man, we did a lot. I want to be a part of a generation that we can look back and say, we recognize this as a problem, and we did everything we could to change it, and we kept that momentum moving. And yeah, I'm an optimist, so I think it's there. I think the possibility is there, and
I do too.
I think we'll get there. It's just I think difficult subjects, difficult
Yeah.
work. Sometimes we just have to keep pushing it forward, and that's become the kind of passion of mine, is to not only assist the individual, but continue just the exposure and continue just pushing the message out there about just the prevalence of abuse in a sport, and how we can do a lot more. So yeah, so
Hmm.
I love the conversation. It's been great, and anytime I said I can get in front of any kind of audience is a wonderful thing for me, because I just, being the optimist I am, I know that some listeners are going to be like, man, they're going to start looking into it. They're going to
Oh
get a little
yeah.
more educated. They're going to do a little bit more, and again, that's a positive move, and
It's
it's
kind of
it's
like a little drip in the lake, and
one
the
at a
waves going out. And because I'll tell you, I have talked to a lot of people about our conversation, and every single one of them was surprised. Every single one of them. And I've talked to a lot of people.
yeah. I talk to professionals in the safety space,
Hmm.
necessarily in the sports space, and when I start throwing the sport numbers out there, they're surprised, and they're like,
Hmm.
man, I didn't realize how serious it was. And that is, again, it just reinforces the idea that I have, that I've got to do everything I can to get this message out there, because part of like the first step, right, is just coming to terms with how
Hmm.
there, and it's happening, right? I think, like I said, you have these survivors that are coming forward and talking about their abuse, and it's just like hearing about the things that they went through. Let's keep it going. Let's get some other people involved in this movement, so those survivors don't feel like they have to shoulder that burden themselves. To advocate,
Yeah.
the professionals out there, we can do more. We can keep this movement moving in the right direction. So again, that my kids and your kids and your kids' kids and their kids, we can say that we are making sure that we're doing everything we can to create a safe environment for them.
Yeah. Help us get out of business.
Please,
We would
please.
love to be out of business.
I tell people all the time, I would love to open a coffee or donut shop somewhere and do that kind of work, and just, but I would love to see a day where it isn't needed, and
Yeah.
but every step in the right direction, every time again somebody just says, yeah, I heard you speak, and I went and started looking stuff up, or I started asking questions to my kids' sports organization, or I went out and I read a couple of things, like it's music to my ears, right? That's just
Hmm.
one more step in the right direction. And as we keep it moving forward, that's how we make big differences, getting more and more people involved. And yeah, and like I said, we're going to get there one way or the other. I'd love to see,
Hmm.
I'm working in this space because I want to be able to, like, move it forward as quickly as possible. Like I said, I've seen too much to say that I can go back and do anything else at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely gives you passion and motivation for sure. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. I appreciate it. And I know our listeners do too. And I think this is great information. And yeah, I'm going to keep talking. I am going to keep talking about this seriously.
No, and just our pre-interview call was fantastic again, because I could tell, your interest in it, and willingness to get this kind of message out to your listeners. Again, I think often once the blindfold is kind of pulled off, people start to go, man. And again, sports and youth, right? Like,
Hmm.
think of two topics that are more important to a lot of people, right? So when you can talk about that, for some it's both, some it's one or the other, but those
Yeah.
are topics that people go, man, that's important to me for a whole lot of different reasons. And yeah, so I think there's a real opportunity for us to kind of keep this movement forward, going
Hmm.
forward, growing it as well. Like you said, just kind of going out further and further and further, because people, the more involved they get, the like I said, the more of an impact they're going to have. But I tell people, like, I don't any involvement is going to make an impact in a good way. So I always challenge people to just do a little research, do a little reading, get more involved.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah, and I promise you'll be surprised at how much of a difference you can make.
Yep.
Just, we don't do ourselves justice in that speak. So yeah, so I love these conversations. As you can tell, like I said, I could talk all day about
Hmm.
good and bad, and I always leave these conversations reinvigorated, going like, fantastic. Like, somebody else has bought in, somebody else gets it, like,
Hmm.
perfect. Like, it's just one more move in the right direction. So I couldn't thank you enough for, giving me the time to kind of get on my soapbox, so to speak, and talk about the things I've learned and the things that I've done over these past, 5 years, 10 years in the safety world. So I certainly
Oh,
appreciate it.
I'm happy to get the word out. Seriously. Thank you again. I love what you're doing. I love your movement, and I think you've already made a difference, and I think you're going to continue to make a difference for sure.
That is my hope. I certainly appreciate your time this morning. Like I said, I've loved it. So I
Hmm.
encourage you to keep in contact. Any of your listeners, like I said, reach out to me. I love talking with people about this kind of stuff. So no questions too small. Like I said, no organization. I talk organizations, individuals, whatever you got, reach out. I'm happy to engage.
Well, we'll have all that information too, so it'll be real easy for everybody to get in touch with you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.